Let's finish this lecture by spending a little time going over some sample exercises so that you have a sort of sense of how to go about, for instance, extracting an argument and putting it into standard form. So this particular exercise that I'm going to do now, the instructions are each of the following passages contains a single argument. Using the letters P and C, identify the premises in the order in which they make the most sense, usually in the order in which they occur. Write both premises and conclusions in the form of separate declarative sentences. So each premise is an individual separate statement. It declares this, and then the next premise declares this, and then the conclusion declares this. So here's our exercise. Titanium combines readily with oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, all of which have an adverse effect on its mechanical properties. As a result, titanium must be processed in their absence. So we already know this passage contains an argument because of the instructions. Our first step then is to identify which are the premises and which are the conclusions. Now you may want to stop the video, try and do this on your own, start the video and see how I do it and compare what I did to what you did. Alright, so let's see how I determine what counts as premises and conclusion. Here we have a conclusion indicator as a result. So that statement is likely to be my conclusion. Titanium must be processed in their absence. What precedes that conclusion then is going to be my candidates for being a premise. Titanium combines readily with oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, all of which have adverse effect on its mechanical properties. So now I want to go to the next step. And again, you might want to stop the video and try and do the next step where you put the argument into standard form, then start the video and see what you did in comparison to what I do. Okay, let's see how we do. Our next step is to rephrase that argument to make the structure apparent. Put it into standard form. Premises go first, conclusion last. The instructions tell us to label our premises. Each premise is a separate declarative statement. So I took that first sentence and I made that my first premise. Titanium combines readily with oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. Then I broke off the second part of that sentence and put it down as a separate declarative statement as my second premise. I modified it to make all of the implicit information explicit so it was easier for the argument's consumer to follow the line of thinking. So my second premise says oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen all have adverse effects on titanium's mechanical properties. Therefore, as a result, titanium must be processed in the absence of oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. So again, I took those phrases, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, and I put them in every statement so that the reader, the consumer of the argument, can re-identify that content throughout the argument, just like it can re-identify the notion of titanium being processed and titanium having mechanical properties. The consumer of my argument will know exactly what I'm referring to, and it's easier, I think, to make it explicit. This makes the argument seem a little redundant in its phraseology, but that's a good thing because what we want to do is minimize the demands on our argument consumer's working memory. We want to make it as easy as possible to follow the content throughout the argument to make those steps from premise to conclusion. Now you might be thinking to yourself, I didn't do all of those things that you just talked about. Does that mean I'm going to get a terrible grade on the next test? No. I try to model what I think is the best practice when I'm doing these examples. But I understand that when you're starting off doing this stuff may not seem natural or obvious or in any way intuitive to you. So you'll want to work on this. You want to work on it in the same way you'd work on your writing. But the most important thing for the purposes of grading the exams and the homework is going to be your ability to identify premises and conclusions and your ability to put them into standard form. And in general, you'll be making choices between different versions that are offered up in multiple choice or multiple select questions. So you won't even have to write them out specifically. Let's look at another example. Determine which of the following passages are arguments. For those that are, identify the conclusion. For those that are not, attempt to determine the kind of non-argument. Let's look at some more examples of exercises. The instructions for these exercises say determine which of the following passages are arguments. For those that are, identify the conclusion. For those that are not, attempt to determine the kind of non-argument. Our first passage is the turkey vulture is called by that name because its red, featherless head resembles the head of a wild turkey. So you might want to stop the video, decide whether or not you think this is an argument in this passage or not. If it is, identify the conclusion. If it isn't, identify which kind of non-argument, those faux arguments that we talked about, you think this passage exhibits, and then start and see how you did in comparison to what I did. Okay, I got this is a non-argument. It reports a fact about turkey vultures, but it doesn't try to establish the conclusion of that. It doesn't try to establish the truth of that argument. This argument is a report of facts. It reports facts about turkey vultures, but it doesn't try to use some of those facts to establish the truth of other facts. It just reports that turkey vultures are named turkey vulture because of features of their head. Let's try another one. It's strongly recommended that you have your house inspected for termite damage at the earliest possible opportunity. Again, you can stop the video, decide whether or not you think this passage contains an argument. If it does, identify the conclusion. If it doesn't, then try and figure out which of the non-arguments, the faux arguments that we discussed in this lecture best represents this passage. When I look at this, I see it's strongly recommended. And so for me, this looks like a non-argument. It's offering a bit of advice or a bit of warning. It tells you to do something. It recommends that you do something, but it again doesn't provide reasons for accepting that recommendation. And so it doesn't provide you with an argument. It merely provides you with that decontextualized recommendation.